The night is thick, almost too still, as if the world itself is holding its breath. In that silence, something stirs, a sound like a slow drip upon cold stone. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm falls into sync with a heartbeat that is not your own. Somewhere in the dark, a single flame trembles. Its light bends and stretches, spilling over walls that have seen too much. A bowl waits beneath the sound, its surface catching the drops as if it understands their weight. This isn't ordinary liquid, this is memory, warm, metallic, alive. Blood. Long before ink wrote history, blood wrote pacts. It sealed oaths between tribes, fed the soil so crops would rise, called gods to listen when prayers were not enough. To some, it was life's most secret thread. To others, it was the one thing the night demanded in return. Every drop is a story, every offering a name whispered to something unseen. There were nights when mothers bled for the earth. There were altars where kings paid with their veins to keep their crowns. And in the corners of history no one likes to look at too long, there were those who bled not for gods, but for power. Because blood does not forget. It clings, it binds, it whispers back. And for as long as humans have feared the night, someone, somewhere, has been bleeding in it.
Blood was never just a liquid. Long before it was studied, weighed, or measured, it was believed to be the pulse of the world itself, the first breath of a newborn, the final heartbeat of the dying, the red thread that tied the living to everything they could not see. Since the first human watched blood spill upon the earth, something ancient stirred, a recognition older than language itself. Blood was not seen as death's mark, but life's most sacred secret. It pulsed with memory, heat, and will. It was the river that moved within flesh, the invisible fire that made breath possible. In the dawn of tribes, before temples or thrones, men and women knelt before stones slick with rain and crimson, believing the gods could drink their pain. Blood was the bridge between the mortal and the divine, the only offering that spoke in the same language as creation. When crops failed, or storms refused to break, when the sky grew silent and spirits turned away, blood was what opened the gate again. To the ancients, this was not cruelty, it was balance. The life of one fed the life of all. The hunter who smeared his kill's blood upon his face did not boast. He honored the spirit of the beast, carrying its strength into his own. In Mesopotamia, the first cities whispered of divine contracts sealed not in ink, but in the lifeblood of kings. In Egypt, the Nile's flooding was called the veins of Osiris himself, his death and resurrection mirrored in the river's pulse. Among the tribes of the steppes, warriors mingled their blood to forge eternal brotherhoods. Among desert peoples, blood oaths tied families tighter than law. Each cut, each drop was a promise that could not be broken. To spill blood unjustly was to offend the cosmos. To spill it with intent was to rewrite fate. The earliest shamans understood this better than any priest who came after. They said the body was only a vessel, but blood was the key. In hidden rites, they traced patterns on stone, believing each pulse carried a whisper to the world beyond. The rhythm of life itself could summon, appease, or command unseen forces. But what began as reverence soon became obsession. The line between offering and hunger blurred. The same rituals that called for blessing began to call for power. Some claimed to taste visions in the iron tang of a few drops. Others believed the spirits demanded more, that the gods themselves grew addicted to the essence of the living. Blood was no longer only the gift of life, it became the currency of control. To hold it, spill it, or command it meant dominion over the boundary between mortal and the divine. And in that shift, from sacrifice to sorcery, something changed forever. Because the power that feeds gods can also feed something else, something far darker that does not give, only takes.
When faith drew its line in the dust, witches stepped across it in red. From the moment blood became sacred, someone sought to claim it. Not the priests in marble halls, but those who worked in shadow, beneath the weight of silence. Women with dirt beneath their nails, midwives, healers, and wise folk, keepers of herbs and secrets too old for the church to sanctify. Their altars were not of gold, but of stone and soil, their prayers whispered through smoke and salt. And when they reached for power, they reached for what pulsed closest to the soul: blood. The essence that the church declared holy was to them merely another tool, potent, unpredictable, alive. Witches did not worship it, they worked with it. They saw it as language, not blasphemy. A drop of blood could name a spirit, seal a pact, or awaken the dormant energy in a charm. In their world, blood was memory, the map of ancestry, the ink of lineage, and the proof that life and death were not opposites, but a circle forever turning. Folklore is thick with whispers of these rites. A witch might prick her finger, letting a drop fall into a candle's flame while murmuring a name. The smoke that rose was said to carry intent into the unseen. In English superstition, a witch bottle, buried beneath a hearth or hidden in the walls, often contained a tangle of hair, pins, and sometimes the maker's own blood. It was both weapon and ward, a living charm that fed on the very essence it was meant to protect. Menstrual blood, too, held its own dark reverence. Feared, shamed, yet secretly used in rites of binding and desire. Old European charm books, half folk medicine, half forbidden text, hinted that such blood mixed into wine or bread could tie a lover's soul to one's own. To the church, this was witchcraft of the most corrupt kind. To the practitioners, it was nature's oldest communion, life feeding life. And then came the animals, the goats, the black hens, the toads. In the woods beyond the reach of the bell tower, covens were said to gather by moonlight. Each creature offered was a vessel, its spilled blood thought to draw spirits close, not for cruelty, but connection. In their world, life was a flame borrowed from the unseen. To give it back was to open a door. Yet, to the eyes of the Inquisition, every droplet was an accusation, every herb-stained hand a pact with the devil. The church saw only inversion, where priests offered bread and wine, witches offered flesh and blood. The Eucharist transfigured spirit into faith, witchcraft turned it back into earth. One was salvation, the other damnation. As the centuries turned, the imagery grew darker, shaped as much by fear as by truth. Pamphlets and trial records described witches cutting their palms to sign grim oaths in blood, or letting it drip onto stones etched with sigils. They were accused of feeding demons, staining altars black, baptizing infants not in holy water, but in their own life's essence. These tales were crafted to horrify, but perhaps they hid an echo of something older, a faith unblessed but not unholy, a covenant between human will and the unseen forces of nature. Some legends even tell of the blood that wasn't shed but shared, witches drinking from one another in ritual communion, believing that by mingling their essence they became kin not by flesh but by spirit. This was called the Red Bond, a pact of unity meant to strengthen their spells and keep their circle unbroken. The church would name it heresy, but in the flicker of the forest fire, it was family. In some rural corners, blood was also used to call upon familiar spirits, entities said to dwell between realms. A witch might leave a drop on bread, milk, or the edge of a blade, offering it to a presence only she could see. The blood acted as both invitation and payment, summoning the unseen to serve or to speak. Sometimes, it was said, the spirit never left. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of blood magic was its silence. The rituals were not grand spectacles, but solitary acts, done in candlelight, in the hush before dawn, or in the corner of a darkened room. A drop pressed into the soil before planting, a cut sealed with ash after calling a name. Each act was small yet profound, a reminder that power, like blood, flows quietly. And still, for every whispered rite, there was a sermon to crush it. The pulpit thundered, "These are the works of Satan. Their blood is unclean, their covenant false." But what the church called corruption, others called understanding. The world, after all, was built on blood of beasts, of men, of gods. If priests could sanctify it, why couldn't witches harness it? In the clash between faith and fear, a darker image of the witch was born, not as healer, but heretic, not as wise woman, but consort of the devil. And blood, once sacred, became the signature of evil. Yet, even centuries later, the echo of those rites still lingers. In forgotten pages and local legends, in the tremor of old charms whispered under breath, blood remains the currency of belief. Terrifying, intimate, alive.
For when faith drew its line, witches stepped across it in red, and the stain has never faded. But where there is power, there is always a bargain. In the grimoires and trial records of the old world, blood did not simply sanctify spells, it sealed pacts. Across Europe, witch hunters and demonologists described a ritual that chilled the bone, the signing of infernal contracts. They claimed a witch would kneel in shadow, prick their finger with a pin or blade, and write their name in blood upon parchment or earth. That single drop was said to bind the soul to another will, the devil, a lesser demon, or something that wore no name at all. To the church, this was the ultimate act of betrayal, a soul willingly marked, an oath written in life's own ink. To those accused, many of whom faced the flames, it was often a story forced under torture. But between the lines of these confessions, whispered and screamed in equal measure, another truth lingers, a belief that blood could speak louder than any prayer. Blood was currency, and with it, one could buy allegiance. Familiars, those eerie companions who slithered through folklore, were said to answer not to charms or words, but to offerings. In old Essex records, a woman was accused of feeding a spirit cat with 3 drops from her finger every full moon. In the Black Forest, stories spoke of toads that appeared at night, their bellies smeared with the blood of their masters, croaking secrets only their summoner could hear. Some witches, they said, bore small marks upon their bodies, a mole, a scar, a hidden cut. These were called witches' teats in the language of the Inquisitors, places where their familiars drank, not metaphorically, but literally. Witch hunters described these bonds with feverish horror. They feed them as mothers feed babes, but the milk is blood and the child is a fiend. Whether these were inventions of fear or echoes of actual secret rites, the image took root and spread like fire through a dry field. In the heart of many grimoires, those forbidden manuals of magic, blood appears not as decoration, but as instruction. A single drop to awaken a sigil, a smear across a circle to give it weight, blood on the tongue to speak a spirit's name without choking. In their logic, the spirit realm was death to air, but sharp to life force. The more personal the offering, the stronger the bond.
This belief turned familiar spirits into something more than myths. They became bound servants, guardians, informants. And yet, as the records remind us, these relationships were not one-sided. If a witch could command a familiar could also claim its due. And when a pact was signed in blood, the cost often grew in silence over time. Legends tell of witches who grew pale and weak, their vitality fading drop by drop. Their familiars, cats, rats, shadowy birds, or shapeless wraiths, would grow stronger, larger, or more cunning. In some accounts, the familiar would no longer wait for an offering. It would take, feeding in the night, leaving its master trembling and anemic by dawn. This intertwining of life and spirit created a story darker than any public trial, a quiet war between body and unseen guest, the witch as both wielder and victim, summoner and bound. And through it all, the same thread ran scarlet beneath the surface: blood. The inquisitors seized on this with brutal efficiency. To them, any wound, any unexplained mark, any strange animal at a doorstep was proof. They carved the language of fear into law. The devil, they said, takes his mark in blood. His servants feed their familiars with the same. Whether these pacts were real or imagined, whispered in lonely nights or forced through broken bones, one truth remains: blood is power. And in the old world, power was never free. But not all blood is given freely. Some is taken.
The line between devotion and terror has always been written in red. Blood, not ink, not gold, was the earliest currency with which humans tried to bargain with the unseen. Long before the witch hunts, long before the word witch itself, people believed there were powers that answered only to blood. They carved altars out of stone and bone, built fires that smoked through the night, and raised their offerings to what they feared most. In the oldest myths, blood was never senseless, it was sacred, a language the gods and spirits could understand. Among herders, a lamb or goat. Among hunters, a bird. Among farmers, a rooster at the crossroads before dawn. The spilling of blood was meant to draw attention, to open a doorway, to feed the shadow behind the name. And in some whispered stories, in the places where the light of the hearth didn't reach, the offerings grew darker. For blood, they believed, was more than a liquid. It was the seat of the soul, the ember of life itself. To give it was to give something of yourself, or of someone else. Across Europe, centuries later, this primal language would be twisted into something monstrous. As fear of witchcraft spread like plague, sacrifices once tied to harvest or protection were painted as pacts with the devil. Every rooster bled at midnight was called a curse. Every lamb slain in silence was branded a satanic offering. And yet, even as priests condemned it, the belief endured in secret corners. A drop of blood at the base of a spell circle, a slit throat of a black hen at a crossroads, a whispered name over a bowl gone dark. Blood was still the key. But where there is belief, fear follows. Human imagination has always walked beside the knife. Rumors grew of witches not just offering animals, but children. Accusations spread like wildfire, of covens that kidnapped infants, of secret sabbats where blood was poured into goblets, of shadowed figures drinking what should never be spilled. No proof was ever found, but fear does not need proof to burn cities. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the phrase "baby sacrifice" became a weapon. Entire communities turned on their neighbors, convinced that the devil himself walked among them. Blood became both the proof of guilt and the justification for cruelty. People forgot the difference between what was real and what was whispered through clenched teeth at night. This was the power of the myth. A single drop could be an offering or a noose. In trial records, interrogators often asked a single chilling question: whose blood was it? They believed witches fed their magic with what they stole from others, that if the devil promised power, the price was measured in crimson. Many confessed under torture, admitting to rites they had never performed, to sacrifices they had never seen. Their words, twisted and broken, fed the panic. But beneath the hysteria lay an older, quieter truth. In nearly every culture, blood was understood to hold weight. It was not spilled lightly. Its offering marked a boundary between worship and violence, between faith and fear. In some places, a goat was enough. In others, whispers claimed a soul must be given. These stories dug their roots deep. A lamb slain in ritual became a girl whispered about in the village. A bowl of animal blood became a chalice of human sacrifice. And soon witchcraft and blood were forever entwined, not just in fear, but in legend. Every drop was a prayer, they said, but sometimes it was also a scream.
Even when torches died out and the last witch pyres cooled into ash, the story of blood never faded. It went underground. It changed its shape. It whispered through the pages of books that were never meant to be read by sunlight. The age of inquisitors gave way to the age of collectors. Men in velvet gloves unlocked libraries. Hidden beneath abbeys, in private cabinets of curiosity, in the dust of forbidden archives, manuscripts were copied and passed in silence. They spoke not of saints, but of shadows. Among them were names that still echo in occult history: the Grand Grimoire, the Key of Solomon, the Grimorium Verum. These were not mere recipe books for spells. They were maps of power, instructions whispered to those who dared to speak in the language of blood. The ink itself was often mixed with it, or so legend claims. Rituals that once required an altar of stone were now inked between leather covers, guarded by wax seals and superstition. They described circles drawn with knives, oaths signed not with quills, but with pricked fingertips. In their pages, blood was never simply a substance. It was described as a binding agent, the price to be paid to force something unseen to listen. A drop for a whisper, a cut for a name, a life for a command. Whether these rituals were practiced or only feared doesn't matter. What matters is how their legend grew. By the 19th century, when Europe began to romanticize its own shadows, the forbidden began to breathe again. Spiritualists held seances in candle-lit parlors. Secret societies and occult orders, the Golden Dawn, Thelema, and others, searched through crumbling texts for fragments of lost rites. Not all embraced blood, but some did. Not always as sacrifice, but as symbol, a way to stir something primal, to make the old ways seem real again. The fascination with blood never needed to be proven true. It only needed to feel dangerous. It became the whispered chapter in the back of every spellbook, the rumor on every occult forum centuries later. Even as the world lit itself with electricity, the idea of blood magic retained its chill. It was the thing too dark to say aloud, and therefore the most desired. Modern occult groups still flirt with its language. Some speak of blood offerings in cryptic phrases. Others stage rituals where a few drops are drawn to seal a pact, to charge a sigil, to mirror what they believe ancient witches once did beneath the moon. And then there are the stories, the ones that spread through cities like a fever. Urban legends of midnight cults, of red rooms, of figures that trade their own blood for power they claim isn't human. No one can say how much of it is real. But the myth refuses to die. It's in whispered online rituals, in modern horror films that echo medieval fears, in the way even a skeptical crowd falls silent when blood enters the story. In the minds of many, blood remains the most dangerous currency in the world of witchcraft, the final, untouchable threshold between play and real. The rituals changed, the languages changed, the world itself changed, but the pulse remained.
Faint but steady, like a heartbeat echoing from the depths of something older than language. We tell ourselves we've outgrown it, that we live in an age of light and reason where blood is only biology. Yet somewhere, deep within the collective memory, that rhythm still calls to us, the reminder that power has always come with a cost. Blood has always been more than substance. It is the breath of our ancestors, the first ink of every covenant, the unspoken line between life and what waits beyond it. Civilizations rose around its meaning, from altars of sacrifice to the chalices of kings. Every drop ever spilled in faith, in war, or in ritual was a declaration, "This is what I'm willing to give." And in that offering, humanity revealed its oldest secret, that we have always believed life could be traded, shaped, or stolen. Even now, in sterile cities and glowing screens, the myth lingers. We don't cut the skin, but we still chase the feeling, the pulse, the rush, the hunger for something greater than ourselves. We whisper words older than prayer, power, control, transcendence. And somewhere in that whisper, blood still answers. It's said that magic fades when belief dies, but blood never needed belief, only the living. It's within all of us, carrying our stories, our fears, our desperate bargains. Perhaps that's why tales of blood magic never truly vanish, because they're not just about witches or rituals. They're about us, about the lengths we'll go to taste what we shouldn't, to touch what was never meant to be touched. So ask yourself, what would you give for power? A moment of pain for a lifetime of control? A drop of blood for a voice that answers back from the dark? And if magic does have a heart, can you still hear it beating? Because somewhere, in the quiet between heartbeats, the old rhythm still murmurs, steady, patient, waiting to be called again. Which ritual would you dare to uncover? Tell us in the comments below, and join us as we continue to descend into the shadows of forgotten magic, where every secret demands its price.